Here we are at Module 7, and for this module we will be discussing specific types of research design that fall under our quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods approaches. Throughout this module we'll be discussing surveys, which include questionnaires and internet surveys. We'll be looking at interviews as well as observation research. Our first area to consider under our research designs is surveys. These include questionnaires and, more recently, internet surveys. As you should recognize, typically this falls under a quantitative approach. Questionnaires ask the same questions of our subjects and are therefore highly standardized. They also allow us to access or consider the larger populations. Internet surveys, we should know, have come about and ultimately really improved our research. They have an ease of access. They allow us then to survey even larger, more diverse populations. When developing and designing questionnaires, there are a number of types of questions that can be included in that questionnaire. First is a closed question. This requires the respondent or your participant to choose from a number of predetermined responses. A common type of question we see in questionnaires is that one that's done on a Likert scale. It allows respondents to determine or respond onto the extent at which. It's not a yes or no question. It allows them to choose on a scale. Our next type of question is a semantic differential. This allows the respondent to be measured for a reaction along a scale with contrasting adjectives at each end. You think about, for a semantic differential scale, that you put, for example, on one end love and on the other end hate, and then there's a degree of love and hate in the middle. The next type of question is a list question. This allows the respondents to potentially pick more than one. That is different from our closed question. A closed question typically allows for one response. A list would allow respondents to choose multiple responses. Next, ranking. This allows the respondent to rank responses in order. It may then allow multiple reactions. And last is a filter. This allows respondents to skip questions that do not apply to them. It's a great way to ensure that your questionnaire asks the appropriate population appropriate questions. Obviously, depending upon your research problem question, as well as your research design and theoretical framework, those things will dictate the types of questions that you may want to consider in your questionnaire. To no surprise, we should recognize that there can be errors in our survey research, or errors in our questionnaires and our internet surveys. First, those errors can be relative to the representation or the population. That is, we may be sampling a population that isn't appropriate for our question. Or those errors may come in the form of our instrument or our questionnaires' inability to ask the right questions. So that would come in the form of our instrument. There are a couple types of errors that we may see, as these are detailed at length in your textbook. Our next type of research design falls under our qualitative method. It is an interview. This slide details the process that one has to potentially go about in generating an interview. First of all, it requires that the researcher get into the field. They have to have access to that particular population. In addition, they probably have to understand the language and or culture of that population. Sometimes it's helpful to locate an informant or someone that's willing to connect the researcher with the sample. Oftentimes for us, this comes in the way of a convenient sampling. We may know someone. Next, the researcher has to recognize that they have to present themselves and ultimately gain trust from the population. Someone that doesn't trust the researcher is likely unwilling to fully answer the questions. And after all of that is done, then the interview can take place. As we've mentioned before under our qualitative research design discussion, Interviews allow us to go more in depth in that they allow us to ask why. They help us get at or below those surface layer questions to then think about why humans make sense of their human experience in the way that they do. Next, we need to talk about our interview techniques. First is what would be a structured interview. This is what I would like to call as a formal interview. It's based upon a set of pre-established questions, and they typically allow for strict administration of the rules. An unstructured interview, or some call it an in-depth interview, allows more open-ended questions. It doesn't necessarily stick to the script, and it allows the interviewee to dictate where the interview goes. Lastly is a group setting. This is where you may have individuals of a similar population come together as a group and interview them in that setting. So, once we have this interview data, what's an appropriate way to analyze that data? There are a couple of things that we need to think about. First is memos. I think this is super helpful and the text discusses this. Memos help the researcher recall, give context to. You can think about it this way as it's the researcher notes. This ultimately will help you as you begin to code data and identify themes. So what is this coding of data? It's essentially the ability to take that raw data or those words spoken in the interview and begin to move them in a stair-step fashion or transition them towards addressing the research question or the concern. One of the things that's super important in interview data and the data analysis of interviews is the ability to identify themes. Let me return to an example I like. When I was in graduate school, one of my colleagues conducted a number of interviews of female basketball players. She wanted to identify common occurrences in their recruiting process. As she began to move through the data of her interviews, she was able to identify that a number of existing themes occurred. Frequency of contact with the coach, items that were discussed in the interviews or the recruiting process, as well as who was influential in their recruiting decision. Those themes began to emerge, or those commonalities across potential interview participants. The last thing then is this idea of validating the data. What does that mean? If we have those themes, what supports or uphold those themes? It's the spoken words from the actual interviews. So for example, if participant 1 said, as well as participant 4 and 5, indicated that parents were the most influential in their determining of which school to attend, that then would support their theme by giving the spoken words that were articulated in the interview. That helps validate the data. Our next type of research design is observation research. This also falls under a qualitative research design. It essentially is describing culture or conducting research in what is a natural setting. There are a number of ways to do this, or the number of ways this is done: ethnography, participant observation, field observation, or natural observation. Oftentimes, that type of observation research is dependent upon the researcher's connection to the observed group. When we're talking about observation research, there are a couple of key components that must be considered. Your textbook goes into these at much greater detail. However, we need to recognize that the role of the observer and the role of the observation site ultimately dictate the observation research. Some observation research is based upon a certain variable. It may be based upon demographic makeup or other characteristics aligned with the research agenda. It may be based upon convenience. Next, we have to consider what the role of the observer is throughout the research process. Does the researcher actually participate with the group? Does the researcher react and or try to respond to questions or behaviors in the group that's being observed? Or is the researcher just a bystander, someone who stands on the outside? All of these things The type of research, observation research, the role of the observer, as well as the observation site are based upon, again, the research in question, the research design, as well as the research paradigm. We have made our way to the end of Module 7. In Module 7, we have addressed some qualitative and some quantitative research designs. At the end of this, there are some things that I want to make sure we recognize. The devil is in the details. Details, details, details. It is important, regardless of the research design you choose, that you pay attention to the details. In addition, you have to recognize that no design is perfect. There are flaws for every research design. However, we need to choose the one that is the closest to perfect for our research project. And finally, think about your strengths. And in that instance, tailor your research design to meet your strengths.